By way of introduction, my name is Beth McConnell. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Public Interest Research Group, PennPIRG. For those of you that are from other states, we might have a state PIRG near you. We have about 28 PIRGs across the nation, and 29. We are a non-profit, nonpartisan consumer advocacy organization. PennPIRG focuses specifically on consumer issues and tax and budget policy. Some state PIRGs also work on environmental issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Vioxx specifically as an example of how drug companies often hide information from healthcare professionals and from the public about the safety of their medicines, and how the FDA, unfortunately, is, I don't want to say asleep at the wheel because that implies that they didn't know what was happening, but unfortunately not acting to protect the public and the situation in Congress and state legislatures. As I get into it, one of the things I just kind of want to hold up, and I don't know if everybody can see this, and some folks may have a copy of it. This is called Dodgeball Vioxx. And this is a memo, or one page of about a 46-page memo that was produced by Merck in about 1999. I think it's the copyright date if you look deep in the document. And this was used for the marketing representatives. This was handed to them in '99 as part of a training of the marketing representatives for how they would handle doctors' questions about the safety of, or efficacy of Vioxx. And again, it's called Dodgeball Vioxx. And here's one of the questions, that obstacle number 8. So this is a question that a doctor might ask when talking to the marketing rep. I use Celebrex, and I'm concerned about the safety profile with Vioxx. And the answer is dodge. Dodge the question. And time again, you know, there is no difference between Vioxx and Celebrex. Why should I use it? I'm concerned about the cardiovascular effects of Vioxx. So, and the last 4 pages of this memo are the words dodge, 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 dodge. That's the last 4 pages of the memo. You know, there's a lot of other stuff in there too. Again, it's a 46-page memo, but the point of it is that they were instructing their marketing representatives as early as 1999, the year that Vioxx was actually on the market, to dodge doctors' questions about the safety of the drug. 1999. Does anybody know when the drug was recalled? Anybody know when it was pulled off the market?
This year.
September 2004. So for 5 years, roughly 5 years, this drug was on the market. Merck knew that there were safety risks with the drug, yet they continued to suppress the information and mislead the public and doctors until finally whistleblowers like Dr. David Graham, who worked for the FDA, and others were aggressively pushing the scientific research and promoting the scientific research that showed there were dangers, and that really forced Merck to finally voluntarily withdraw Vioxx from the market in 2004. Now, Dr. Graham, who is still with the FDA as far as I know, despite some threats and, he's obviously in a pretty difficult position right now, he estimates that 140,000 patients suffered heart disease as a result of taking Vioxx over that period of time, over that 5 years, and 55,000 patients actually died as a result. And this is just one drug that we're talking about. And I'm going to kind of go through just a timeline really quickly, and some of you may have seen this handout. I don't know if there's any left, but PennPIRG is about to launch a campaign. We're going to launch it in early July. So this is kind of a new thing for us. We want to get the state legislature to pass a bill that will essentially tell the drug companies, if you want to sell and market your products here in Pennsylvania, you have to certify in writing to the state that you have published all of the clinical trials, including the ones that say that your drugs are unsafe, in order for you to be able to do business. We're about to launch that campaign in the next couple of weeks, and this is a kind of a draft of a fact sheet that we'll be distributing. And on the side is a timeline, again, that kind of goes through Vioxx as an example. Again, 1999 is when the FDA gave approval to Merck to begin marketing and selling Vioxx. In 2000, we know now that Merck had its own clinical trial called VIGOR, and the VIGOR study showed that patients taking Vioxx had twice the rate of cardiovascular problems as patients taking a similar drug. And the researchers specifically pointed to the molecular structure of Vioxx as the reason why that was the case. Yet despite that study, Merck issued a press release later in 2000 that said that there is no difference in heart attack risk between Vioxx and other pain medications. Merck issued another press release later in 2001 that was titled Merck Confirms Favorable Cardiovascular Safety Profile of Vioxx. And in 2003, Merck spent $500 million marketing Vioxx to medical professionals. And again, it wasn't until September of 2004 that they finally had to pull the drug from the market. So that just kind of gives you a sense of all that period of time they were aggressively and heavily marketing this drug as being safe. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about how they could get away with that, and also how Vioxx is not really the only example of that. Part of the problem right now is that it's really up to the drug companies to decide what information, what results of their clinical trials is worthy enough to notify the FDA and notify the public. So they can essentially do research about a drug, they can find that the drug is dangerous, and they can choose to keep that information secret. They don't have to publish it in medical journals. And again, that's partially what happened with Vioxx. And even though there were some independent studies that were done that were raising some concern, Merck still was able to suppress that information. And the FDA, because the clinical trials weren't published, the trials that Merck did, the FDA had very little control or power to actually require stricter warning labels or better disclosure on the drug itself or in their advertising or marketing. The drug companies actually pay the FDA for approval of the drugs. So we have a huge department at the FDA that's charged with getting drugs on the market as quickly as possible, and that's funded almost entirely by the drug companies. We have a very, very, very tiny portion of the FDA that's focused on monitoring the safety of those drugs once they're actually on the market. And that's because the funding for that comes from Congress, not from the drug companies, and not surprisingly, Congress has not given the FDA the kind of resources that it needs to really monitor the safety of these drugs once they're on the market. Now, you'd think that the FDA would be saying, you know, look, we don't have a lot of power right now, we don't have enough money, and we don't have enough resources. You'd think they'd be saying to Congress, fix this problem because we want to protect patients. But instead, Lester Crawford, who's the acting commissioner of the FDA right now, he's been nominated by President Bush to be the permanent commissioner. He was at a conference, a pharmaceutical industry-sponsored conference in Great Britain this past spring. So while all this stuff about Vioxx is all over the news, it's headline news, it's unbelievable stuff, he's literally about to be confirmed to be the head of the FDA. He says to a group of pharmaceutical reps in the UK, consumer protections are getting in the way of getting drugs on the market, and we need to change that. And I don't know about you guys, but I didn't see a lot of coverage of that in the U.S. press, but that seemed just absolutely alarming and outrageous to me that he would make such a statement in light of all that has happened with Vioxx. Paxil is another example of a drug that's been heavily marketed and pushed for young children, actually, teenagers. Later, it was found that this drug increased suicidal tendencies of kids. In fact, the New York Attorney General Elliot Spitzer is suing GlaxoSmithKline right now, a huge lawsuit over their role in pushing that drug despite the dangers. And there are, I think, thousands of class action lawsuits against Merck right now because of Vioxx in light of the Vioxx scandals. There are some leaders in Congress that are standing up. Chuck Grassley, who's a Republican senator from Iowa, if I'm remembering correctly, and Chris Dodd, who's a Democratic senator from Connecticut, have introduced legislation in Congress that would require that all clinical trials be made public. But not surprisingly, there is little interest among leadership in the U.S. Senate and certainly among the Bush administration to allow that bill to come up for a vote. And so right now it's pretty much stalled. And that's why states are starting to act, states that are concerned about the health and safety of their citizens. Rather than waiting for Congress to do it, we can pass actually legislation here in Pennsylvania. In fact, Maine passed a bill last week. State of California has been considering legislation. Those bills, again, would require that if a drug company wants to market and sell their drugs, they need to certify that they have published the results of all their clinical trials in a database that already exists. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. That database is administered by the National Institutes of Health, but right now it's voluntary, so drug companies only have to publish their studies if they want to. In fact, a bunch of drug companies said last year, you know, in light of all these scandals, okay, we'll do a better job of publishing clinical trials. But a recent investigation shows that they're simply not doing it. There was an article from May 31st, and I think it appeared in the New York Times. It's called, "Despite Vow, Drug Makers Still Withhold Data." It says Merck, Pfizer, and GlaxoSmithKline, 3 of the 6 largest drug companies, have met the letter but not the spirit of the agreement to publish clinical trials. The 3 companies have filed only vague descriptions of many studies, often failing to even name the drugs under investigation. For example, Merck describes one trial as a one-year study of an investigational drug in obese patients, but it doesn't tell you what the drug is. So even if a medical professional wanted and was able to do the research and sit down and look through, there's sometimes that information simply isn't out there for them. And as a consumer watchdog, if we want to look through these clinical studies and find if there's potentially dangerous drugs that are on the market, again, we don't have the full picture and the information that we could use to help educate doctors and get this information in the press. And that, I think, has to change. If any of you are from Pennsylvania, want to be more active and want to be more involved, in particular if you have a friend or a family member that's been affected by Vioxx or other dangerous drugs that are on the market, your legislator really needs to hear from you, and we'd be thrilled to work with you to kind of get that message out there. Meanwhile, we're going to continue to try and push federal legislation because we don't need to just protect patients in Pennsylvania, we need to protect them everywhere. And we also need reform of the FDA. This is just a small piece of kind of a broader need to fix the problems at the FDA and get a real commissioner who's going to act in the interest of consumers and not in the interest of drug companies. So that's a much bigger campaign and a kind of a bigger effort than we have time for today, but I think that's something that really needs to happen and we're going to continue to work on.
I think we have to attack the drug industry at every front, everywhere, with every resource and every creative way that we have. Chipping away at the omnipotent power of the drug industry is a task that we obligated to follow in every direction. Even legislation to require physicians to declare what gift they got from drug companies over $25. Even little things like that begin to really chip away at the power of the drug companies. You have to really understand how this industry behaves on a day-to-day basis to really appreciate the power that they have with the American people. It's just amazing. So anything, even as small as requiring them to just sign a letter saying that they have published all the clinical trials, is in itself a small step.
It also is, I mean, in terms of drug safety, it's an important step because I think, now I might be wrong about this, but I think that if they have to make, they don't necessarily have to publish them in medical journals, but they have to be publicly available for the FDA or for the public to look at. And so if they do have to make all those studies available, I mean with Paxil, for example, the drug got approved for use in depression in children because they presented the 3 studies to the FDA that said it worked, but they didn't present the 3 studies that showed that it didn't work and made kids suicidal. I mean, if this law goes into place, those 3 the FDA would have seen all the studies and they might not have approved the drug. So this does have some potential real-world implications for what drugs might be approved and not approved.
If they sell you a drug that you don't need, which has side effects, it can lead to you taking another drug that you know, to treat the side effects, and just one more way they make a lot of money.
Some doctors have actually said that many of the patients taking Vioxx would have been better off with aspirin.
Right.
Would it be possible to do something like have them document what studies they're going to be doing, and that way you could follow up and find out what the outcome is after, instead of if there, I think Adam mentioned 3 good studies and 3 that came out with negative results, that they'll just eliminate those. So if they have to say what they're studying ahead of time, then they're more required, they're more obligated.
Well, there are, and Adam, you may know more details about that, but I'm under the impression if a drug company is conducting clinical trials in a state, there is a regulatory process they have to go through with the state when they're conducting those clinical trials to follow a set of kind of guidelines and standards and things, but that doesn't mean that they actually have to publish the results after the fact. So there may be some way to meld the 2 things together to do follow-up. And I think that's something that consumer watchdog groups can do and elected officials that are concerned can do is, kind of mush these 2 things together and be able to kind of help law enforcement follow up if they see that something doesn't quite jive. There were studies that Merck knew about that should have been published that said the drug was dangerous. And if we don't even get that stuff, something's really wrong. And so there are a million problems that we do have to fix, and the pharmaceutical industry and their nefarious is just, it just doesn't end. But, this is a step. It's one step. It's not the last step, but I think it's one that there is political support for, and particularly in light of the situation in the state legislature and in Congress, where it's kind of a tough place. This is one thing that we do have bipartisan support for, so it's kind of a way to push back a bit.
What happens when the side effects are worse than the disease. Now, I have a report from a leading drug that was on. I remember watching the internal memo. The side effects had to be listed, and what they did is they listed diarrhea, depression. They listed about 20 things, and in the middle of it was, and death. Death was not a side effect. And it's true. I mean, because this is what, people go into these clinical trials, and I was getting people to go to these clinical trials for these organizations. I saw it, and I said, this cannot, you got to tell people, I question if doctors really, all drugs have side effects, so if they tell you it doesn't, they're lying. Every drug has side effects, and again, I think this should be key. What are the side effects of this drug, and what is, is there a history of that? And they should be required to present that as one of the first things. The other thing the drug companies do, and this is what is happening in this country and in the world, is that I believe in alternative medicines, and I also have a question is, the proof is out there, is the question of who monitors. The drug companies shouldn't have to finally say, whether or not alternative medicine has worked, because they're obviously going to say it's not. But to give you an example of, alternative medicines, as they call, cannot be used to treat a disease. All right? So everything now is a disease. Obesity is a disease, and this is how the drug companies get you in. They have the reason they get children who are hypertension or not hypertension or hypersensitive or have attention. That's a disease now, so only the drug companies can treat it. It's a con game, and this is another way we need to stop. Everything is a disease. If you have an upset stomach, it's now a disease, so they can only want to treat it. It's a con game, so that alternative medicine cannot be taken seriously and not going to provide an alternative. Somebody independent has to be. I don't know who monitors the FDA. But somebody needs to. It needs to be an independent research. And doctors, I think, also need to really push on what are the side effects of these drugs and ask the question, what happens when the side effects are worse than the disease? What do you do for your patients then?
Oh, yeah. I think that one of the reforms that's being proposed in the FDA now is that there's going to be a separate commission in the FDA to look at the post-marketing effects of drugs, which is essentially side effects, which is what you're talking about, which in technical terms is called stage 4. Help me out, Anne-Marie. Stage 3 clinical trials are big randomized studies that are done at like 10 academic university hospitals, and then once a drug is approved, then it's called phase. That's the word I'm looking for. Phase 4, which is after a drug is approved and it's on the market, side effects get reported to the FDA. So there's going to be a panel that is supposedly independent and reports to the FDA and whose purpose is specifically going to be to monitor for side effects of drugs and to do more systematic surveillance for problems with drugs like Vioxx. So I hope that will address part of what you're concerned about.
Michael Sisko is president of Citizens for Responsible Care and Research, which is a non-profit national organization whose goal is to improve safeguards for human research subjects. CIRCARE opposes the exploitation and deception of human subjects in unethical studies that violate the human rights, welfare, or best medical interests of the individual subject. They've done some exceptional work in nosing out the underreporting of what's known in the scientific literature as adverse events, of which there have been literally thousands more than researchers originally admitted to. And with that, I will pass this over to Michael Sisko.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the era of blind faith in science and scientists is sort of over, because there is a lot of adverse events, a lot of deaths, a lot of ill effect that happens that seems to often be covered up, and we need to really question what happens at times. Now, I was asked by the organizers to talk a little bit about the Gelsinger case. Have you all heard of that particular case? The first genetic insertion experiment that resulted in a death. Some of you have. Okay, right up the street. I'm sorry? Gelsinger is Gelsinger. Just up the road here, I guess it's up the road if I'm right in my geography, the University of Pennsylvania and the Westar Institute is where the study was done. And an 18-year-old teenager died. He wasn't in a critical condition. He had an enzyme deficiency. Life was a little difficult, and he thought maybe he could get cured by putting in through a viral vector a gene to insert in his genomic system and hopefully make the defective enzyme corrected. What happened, though, was his death. The FDA, when they wrote to James Wilson, who was the lead investigator, said, "You failed to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of the subjects." When you do a genetic insertion, you don't know where the gene is going to end up, and so it's very iffy research. Then you don't know how the gene is going to be expressed. So it was highly experimental. And when the study was done, Jesse, Paul's son, who's on in our organization, I talked to him to sort of get briefed on this. He was in a log dose increase study, meaning that they had cohorts, they gave a certain amount of the viral load and they kept increasing it. But as they were doing the study, they were getting a lot of negative results. They were getting high fever, a lot of adverse events. They should have stopped the protocol, but the study kept going on. Part of that, and why does that happen? There's a little bit of the Nobel Prize syndrome where the researcher just has to go forward to see if they can get results. Maybe the next thing will do it. But they had clear indications that it wasn't really working. In this case, males were more fragile than the females, and a female earlier in the cohort, had a lot of ill effects that survived, but Jesse did not. So it was quite tragic. The failures were more than that. They had animal studies. I know some people there's a lot of protests with animal rights. Well, animals have more protection than human subjects often. All the research on animals is covered, but not all of human research is covered. Because if you're doing privately funded research, there's no protections in place, basically. But anyway, they had studies prior, and monkeys had adverse effects, and some died. But this was not communicated to the fellow offering his son in research. So fair is fair. You should tell people fully of the adverse events that could happen. There were side effects typical of this type of treatment: chills, nausea, and vomiting. They weren't informed of that. Gelsinger said that they misrepresented efficacy. They sort of get you involved in the study and hint that this is really going to work, and that they have some evidence to that, but there in fact was no evidence. The FDA was aware of some of these problems, but didn't put a brake on them. So finally, Paul got some money as a settlement. There was an end of a civil settlement just recently this February where the government found a lot of wrongdoing on the part of the researchers. But the penalty for this fellow breaking all the protocol was just 5 years suspension of research and some special monitor to make sure he's doing it okay. So he basically can continue doing research even though he did a lot of violating protocols and ended up killing somebody. So it's just a lot of the political influence of the University of Pennsylvania and just being on that side of the power spectrum. And, somebody dies, but there's not a real accountability, apparently. And that's very disappointing. There was no real apology either. Paul had asked for, look, let's admit that there was something wrong here, archive all the documents so that we can then learn what really happened. No public apology. So basically what he asked for, he didn't get. It should be sort of an era of accountability. You hear about it I know at social service where I work, every little bus token is accounted for. But yet, where is the accountability in medical research and when somebody dies? And so it is quite tragic. There seems to be one of the main issues is really, when you look at this whole topic, and I think it was alluded to by Peter, is just the idea of adverse events, owning up to what's negative. Science is supposed to be objective. You look at the positive, what's good, and if something bad happens, you own up to it. But there's a lot of lack of transparency where we really don't know, as you enter a study, what is really the risk involved. Like in the asthma study where a woman died at Hopkins in my hometown, Ms. Rose, she was given a long informed consent form, very professional literature, but nowhere was it evident that you might die from this study. And she did die. It was a couple years ago. A healthy young volunteer who worked for Hopkins University. So we need to fully inform people of the risk if you're going to offer yourself as a subject for human research. So that's just the base. And we can get into the philosophic reasons why they're not, reporting the negative. And one of them is simply it's bad for business. If you tell of the negative, then you're likely to lose your billion-dollar drug, and only a few thousand might use the drug that really desperately need to, but not just everybody. Let me review. I don't know exactly, how to go with this. It's a pretty extensive topic, but let me just point out some basic things that are gaps in current research ethics. One I've already sort of mentioned, no private research is covered. So if somebody privately funds something, the drug company, without government money, there's no official federal oversight involved. Also, the second thing is that we really don't have a good record of our adverse events, what's really happening. In medicine, there's a lot of adverse events. In research, there's probably double. When you have something risky and experimental, you're going to get a lot more adverse events. But there's really no official, national, web-based, computerized reporting system. So you have these individual RIBs all over the country with their own reporting requirements and making reams of raw data, but nobody knows the real pattern of adverse events. A CBS producer called me the other day asking, well, what about the deaths, and I had to refer her to one member of our group who has done a statistical analysis suggesting that maybe thousands, even tens of thousands have died, but we can only infer because we don't have the data. If you intervene on the base level of your molecular or physiologic level, there's a tendency for your body to resist that. It's called homeostasis. Your body doesn't like to be pushed on that base level. Therefore, if you have a medicine that influences that level, you're going to have to give it a pretty big hit to move it off center. And if you do that, you're going to tend to get adverse events and some deaths. It's just sort of what happens. And so I'm not surprised by Vioxx causing some deaths. I'm not surprised by antidepressants causing suicidality. It's just that if you have a molecular physiologic level intervention, that's the risk that you have. That's okay, but we should be honest about that. You might want to get the effect that that drug indeed has. Maybe it's going to lower your cholesterol, but you should be aware it's going to also potentially have these other effects. The FDA seems to be limited in its resources and oversight. It's sort of weighted to drug approval. They have user industry fees that are financing some jobs to get the drugs on the fast track to be approved. But in terms of safety afterwards, it's sort of catch as can, and there's not much authority to really deal with it. The FDA does not have the authority to require industry to conduct any further studies once it's been approved. So say like the classic case of the drug Vioxx. Vioxx is an anti-arthritic drug. Maybe some people did benefit from it. They maybe couldn't get out of bed. They took the Vioxx, it helped them. And what happens is that you advertise it, and millions of people start to take it because they have minor aches and pains. Meanwhile, there's risk of cardiovascular disease, maybe a small percentage relatively, but if you have millions of people, it could be thousands of deaths. The thing is you've got to be honest in your portrayal of the adverse events. Now the FDA finally, because of the scandal, they put a black box warning. Look, there is this risk, and if you want to take it, you should be aware of it. So what's happening is this tension between really knowing what the impact of something is and the industry having a billion-dollar blockbuster drug whose incentive is to downplay the adverse events. And there's no real gatekeeper. The FDA doesn't really have the authority to follow up on these drugs once they're on the market. So it takes about 6 years to get a drug off the market. And how do we know what's really happening with that drug? 10% maybe of the adverse events are being reported. It's a voluntary system now. If you're taking a drug and you get an adverse event, you go to the hospital. It's up to the doctor if he's going to report that adverse event. And only a small percent get reported. So there's a lot of damage that could be being done, but we don't know about it. So there should be more accountability. If something happens, it should be recorded. And we could become aware of patterns of deaths and whatever's happening. So those are just some basic, really astounding to me, gaps in the ability to protect public safety. We hear about a lot of 9/11 public safety, but what about the public safety of our own medical treatment?
Very difficult position right now. He estimates that 140,000 patients suffered heart disease as a result of taking Vioxx over that period of time, over that 5 years, and 55,000 patients actually died as a result. And this is just one drug that we're talking about. And I'm going to kind of go through just a timeline really quickly, and some of you may have seen this handout. I don't know if there's any left, but PennPIRG is about to launch a campaign. We're going to launch it in early July. So this is kind of a new thing for us. We want to get the state legislature to pass a bill that will essentially tell the drug companies, if you want to sell and market your products here in Pennsylvania, you have to certify in writing to the state that you have published all of the clinical trials, including the ones that say that your drugs are unsafe, in order for you to be able to do business. We're about to launch that campaign in the next couple of weeks, and this is about the safety of the drug. 1999. Does anybody know when the drug was recalled? Anybody know when it was pulled off the market?
This year.
September 2004. So for 5 years, roughly 5 years, this drug was on the market. Merck knew that there were safety risks with the drug, yet they continued to suppress the information and mislead the public and doctors until finally whistleblowers like Dr. David Graham, who worked for the FDA, and others were aggressively pushing the scientific research and promoting scientific research that showed there were dangers, and that really forced Merck to finally voluntarily withdraw Vioxx in the market in 2004. Now, Dr. Graham, who is still with the FDA as far as I know, despite some threats and, he's obviously in a way of introduction, my name is Beth McConnell. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Public Interest Research Group, PennPIRG. For those of you that are from other states, we might have a state PIRG near you. We have about 28 PIRGs across the nation, and 29. We are a non-profit, nonpartisan consumer advocacy organization. PennPIRG focuses specifically on consumer issues and tax and budget policy. Some state PIRGs also work on environmental issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Vioxx specifically as an example of how drug companies often hide information from healthcare professionals and from the public about the safety of their medicines, and how the FDA, unfortunately, is, I don't want to say asleep at the wheel, because that implies that they didn't know what was happening, but unfortunately not acting to protect the public and the situation in Congress and state legislatures. As I get into it, one of the things I just kind of want to hold up, and I don't know if everybody can see this, and some folks may have a copy of it. This is called Dodgeball Vioxx. And this is a memo, or one page of about a 46-page memo that was produced by Merck in about 1999. I think it's the copyright date if you look deep in the document. And this was used for the marketing representatives. This was handed to them in 99 as part of a training of the marketing representatives for how they would handle doctors' questions about the safety of, or efficacy of Vioxx. And again, it's called Dodgeball Vioxx. And here's one of the questions, that obstacle number 8. So this is a question that a doctor might ask when talking to the marketing rep. I use Celebrex, and I'm concerned about the safety profile with Vioxx. And the answer is dodge. Dodge the question. And time again, there is no difference between Vioxx and Celebrex. Why should I use it? I'm concerned about the cardiovascular effects of Vioxx. So, and the last 4 pages of this memo are the words dodge, 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 dodge. That's the last 4 pages of the memo. There's a lot of other stuff in there too. Again, it's a 46-page memo, but the point of it is that they were instructing their marketing representatives as early as 1999, the year that Vioxx was actually on the market, to dodge doctors' questions about